Antes de comenzar, les vamos a pedir, por favor, mantener los teléfonos celulares apagados o en silencio para así no interrumpir este seminario internacional y lo que vamos a disfrutar en el día de hoy. Queremos darles la bienvenida a todos ustedes a este cuarto seminario internacional Liderando escuelas en contextos desafiantes, fortaleciendo las capacidades para la mejora, organizado por el Centro de Desarrollo del Liderazgo Educativo CEDLE. El centro se encuentra constituido por la alianza entre la Universidad Diego Portales, la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, la Universidad de Talca, la Universidad Católica de Temuco y la Escuela de Graduados de la Universidad de California, Berkeley, bajo el patrocinio del Ministerio de Educación. Queremos agradecer también, antes de dar inicio a las palabras que nos convocan en el día de hoy, a quienes nos encuentran presentes. Está con nosotros el director del Centro de Desarrollo del Liderazgo Educativo, al doctor José Weinstein Cayuela, también a los directores de carreras, de departamentos y en especial a nuestra invitada internacional, la doctora S Finnigan de la Universidad Rochester, Estados Unidos, a quien le damos la bienvenida. Queremos también saludar y dar la bienvenida a los directivos escolares y profesores del sistema escolar, supervisores ministeriales, académicos, profesionales, investigadores, estudiantes de pre- y postgrado que nos acompañan, y a todos ustedes, muy buenos días. Esperamos que sea una jornada provechosa para cada uno de ustedes con esta nuestra invitada internacional. Para comenzar entonces, en primer término, vamos a invitar en primer lugar a escuchar las palabras del doctor José Weinstein Cayuela, director del Centro Nacional de Desarrollo del Liderazgo Educativo, académico e investigador de la Universidad Diego Portales, a quien le damos la bienvenida.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Buenos días a todos, a todas quienes han querido estar aquí esta mañana. Como ustedes saben, el centro, el CEDLE, de Centro de Desarrollo del Liderazgo Educativo, que hemos conformado entre 4 universidades nacionales, la Universidad Diego Portales, la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, la Universidad Católica de Temuco, la Universidad de Talca, más la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Nos hemos propuesto tratar de impulsar y potenciar el tema del liderazgo educativo en Chile. Y lo hemos hecho de distintas maneras. Hemos hecho muchas investigaciones. Este año, que es el año en que termina el financiamiento del CEDLE por parte del Ministerio de Educación, habremos culminado 24 investigaciones que se han hecho sobre muy distintos temas. Hemos también hecho formación haciendo 3 diplomados, más muchísimos cursos en los cuales se van a ver graduado más de casi 1000 personas, más de 800 personas de todas maneras, hacia el final del año. Adicionalmente a eso se han hecho este tipo de conferencias y charlas y talleres en que van a participado más de 7000 personas en el curso del periodo. Así que es una labor bastante completa, en la cual por una parte se promueve el conocimiento, porque pensamos que es muy clave promover ese conocimiento para poder hacer buenas políticas y buenas prácticas en el tema del liderazgo. Adicionalmente a eso se hace formación y construcción de capacidades. Y adicionalmente a eso tratamos de poner temas en el debate público y tratar de hacer de alguna manera un puente con lo que se está discutiendo e investigando a nivel internacional. De tal manera que nosotros los chilenos, chilenas, estemos al día de lo que está ocurriendo en el resto del mundo respecto a este tema. No para copiarlo, por cierto, mecánicamente, cada realidad es distinta, pero sí para estar alerta, para saber cuáles son los temas de preocupación, para saber cuáles son los últimos avances que existen respecto al tema, de tal manera de inventar nuestras propias soluciones a partir de lo más nuevo que exista en el campo. Y en ese sentido es que hemos creado estas conferencias internacionales, pero no solo eso, que también, por ejemplo, hemos editado una serie de libros, la serie Liderazgo Educativo, en que cada año también hemos ido haciendo este esfuerzo sistemático por también traer a Chile lo que se está discutiendo sobre distintos temas que están de actualidad. Eso lo hacemos en el convencimiento también de que en Chile tenemos un rezago respecto a este tema. Déjenme graficárselo en una anécdota que me pasó el año pasado. Estaba en un congreso de investigación conversando con distintos académicos y les comentaba yo con mucha emoción y real satisfacción e interés que íbamos a tener una ocasión muy especial y que con mi colega Gonzalo Muñoz, que está aquí presente, teníamos la posibilidad de repetir después de 10 años una encuesta nacional que habíamos hecho el año 2009, que fue una encuesta que hicimos, que fue la primera, yo creo, gran encuesta que se hizo en Chile sobre el tema de los directivos escolares, centrado en el tema de las prácticas, informadas por los docentes, que es como tienen que ser informadas. Si la informan los propios directivos, habitualmente no se tienen resultados muy fiables, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, son los profesores los que informan las prácticas de los directivos. Y yo les contaba, mire qué maravilla, vamos a poder hacer una investigación en la cual este año vamos a poder repetir eso que hicimos el año 2009 y vamos a poder saber qué pasó con las prácticas de los directivos escolares. En estos 10 años, si ustedes piensan, han pasado muchas cosas que debiesen haber afectado esas prácticas. Piensen, por ejemplo, que, bueno, se ha desarrollado en plenitud la ley SEP, hemos tenido, ¿no es cierto?, ley respecto al tema de convivencia, y hemos tenido encargado de convivencia en los colegios, hemos tenido un nuevo sistema de selección de los directivos escolares, hemos tenido atribuciones para los directivos públicos que antes no teníamos, ¿no es cierto?, como la de conformar sus propios equipos directivos, hemos tenido una nueva versión del marco de la buena dirección, en fin, hay muchas razones para pensar que pueden haber habido cambios muy importantes estos 10 años, y por eso nosotros estamos tan apasionados de saber qué es lo que ocurrió y muy expectante de qué es lo que pasa en esta comparación de 10 años después con la misma investigación de las prácticas. Y yo comentaba esto y los colegas con los que estaba conversando me decían, muy interesante su investigación. Y me mostraban la investigación de ellos, que vienen haciendo también encuestas hace 10 años. Pero ellos habían partido su primera encuesta como institución el año 1928. Es decir, ellos comparaban 90 años de investigación. Podían ver, por ejemplo, cuándo habían empezado a existir los magísteres en liderazgo y gestión escolar y cuándo se habían introducido, qué había pasado. En fin, tenían una visión de 90 años y esto lo estaban celebrando el año 2018 en que tenían resultados de ese año. Entonces, solo se los pongo como anécdota para graficarles que efectivamente estamos haciendo en Chile, yo creo, muchas actividades, pero es una investigación que tiene un rezago, que tiene una juventud muy grande, que le faltan muchas áreas, que tiene áreas de luz y muchas áreas de sombra. Por ejemplo, sabemos mucho menos lo que pasa en los establecimientos privados subvencionados que lo que pasa en los establecimientos municipales. Los establecimientos municipales han sido mucho más estudiados que los establecimientos privados subvencionados. Sabemos mucho más lo que pasa en la enseñanza básica que lo que pasa en la enseñanza media. Sabemos mucho más lo que pasa con los directores y directoras que con lo que pasa con el resto de los equipos directivos. Y así por delante. Es decir, tenemos muchos temas todavía que son puntos ciegos de nuestra investigación y que por lo tanto tenemos que alentar y seguir avanzando. Esa es la idea, por lo tanto, de estos libros o estas conferencias, este esfuerzo, ¿no es cierto?, de ponernos al día. Paso un aviso solamente para los que les pueda interesar el tema. El 6 al 8 de junio, en esta misma sala, se va a inaugurar, digamos, después se va a hacer en todo este edificio, un congreso que estamos organizando también sobre este mismo tema, que se llama Congreso Iberoamericano de Liderazgo y Mejora Escolar, SILME. Y durante 3 días vamos a tener la posibilidad de compartir con expertos internacionales de distintos lugares del mundo, de conocer trabajos de investigación respecto a este tema, de conocer experiencias, porque no son solo investigaciones en este caso lo que va a haber, sino también experiencias que van a ser también. Así que los que les interese esto, les digo, entren a este sitio www.silme.cl porque todavía hay cupos disponibles. Cierro el aviso y vuelvo al tema central, ¿no es cierto?, el esfuerzo a hacer las conferencias. Las conferencias han tenido, esta es la 4ª versión. La primera versión, quizás algunos de ustedes estuvieron acá, fue de 2 académicas de Berkeley, Judith Warren Little y Rebecca Cheung. Tuvimos la posibilidad de conocer de primera fuente todo el trabajo que sobre todo Warren Little había hecho respecto del tema de las comunidades de aprendizaje. Y por lo tanto, ella nos ilustró, ¿no es cierto?, qué quiere decir este concepto de comunidades profesionales de aprendizaje que después ha tenido tanta incidencia en el debate y que después, ¿no es cierto?, ha tenido distintos momentos y también distintas conceptualizaciones y se ha visto como de los temas críticos para el liderazgo educativo. El tema, ¿no es cierto?, todos lo sabemos, promover comunidades de aprendizaje es como un mantra que tenemos, ¿no es cierto?, presente en los equipos directivos y parte del liderazgo. Bueno, Warren Little había sido los creadores de ese concepto y por lo tanto tuvimos la posibilidad aquí de que ella nos ilustrara, ¿no es cierto?, qué es lo que había aprendido y qué también había ocurrido con ese tema. Y esa fue la primera conferencia que tuvimos respecto a este punto. El segundo año invitamos para la conferencia a un académico inglés, psicólogo de origen, muy reconocido, a Christopher Day. Y Day nos hizo una exposición más amplia sobre el tema del liderazgo, pero en el cual también se detuvo en temas muy importantes. Por ejemplo, se detuvo en el tema de la importancia de cómo los líderes tenían que generar confianza como un tema clave y cómo tenían que ocuparse de los temas relacionales en las escuelas. También se detuvo en un tema específico referido a la adversidad, qué es lo que significaba trabajar en condiciones muy adversas. E incluso ahí, ¿no es cierto?, nos mostró parte de su trabajo más reciente que tenía que ver con una traída hacia el campo de la investigación del concepto de resiliencia, que muchas veces nosotros se ha usado, ¿no es cierto?, respecto de la posibilidad de niños que viven en circunstancias muy adversas, sin embargo, poder superarlas. Y se investiga, ¿no es cierto?, qué tienen esos niños de particular. Bueno, en este caso, lo que hizo Day fue mostrarnos cómo ese era un tema que también era importante de trabajar al nivel de la educación. Y cómo también los docentes, los directivos tenían que ser resilientes para trabajar en contextos particularmente adversos. Por lo tanto, ahí también tuvimos, ¿no es cierto?, de regalo esa posibilidad de tener, ¿no es cierto?, nuevos conceptos que nos ilustraran por qué camino se estaba transitando la discusión educativa. El año pasado tuvimos la posibilidad de tener aquí a Luis Gómez, académico de la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles, de UCLA. Y Gómez lo que hizo fue básicamente hacer un relato respecto en qué consistía el trabajo que él con otro muy reconocido sociólogo de la educación que se llama Anthony Brake había realizado respecto de lo que se ha llamado las ciencias de la mejora, que ellos escribieron en un libro hace unos 4 años atrás y de ahí en adelante se ha convertido realmente en una corriente muy influyente, porque lo que hace las ciencias de la mejora es una suerte de aterrizaje de todos estos conceptos que se han dado tanto a conocer, ¿no es cierto?, por años y años respecto de, bueno, lo que es la efectividad escolar, ¿no es cierto?, en qué consiste la mejora, en qué consisten las escuelas efectivas. Y siempre se dice, ¿no es cierto?, bueno, las escuelas efectivas tienen estos rasgos. Son escuelas que tienen directivos escolares con mucho liderazgo pedagógico, son escuelas en las cuales el currículum se adecua a las necesidades de los alumnos, son la escuela en que los padres y apoderados participan muchísimo en la vida escolar, son escuelas en que se logra una motivación de los alumnos muy alta, son escuelas que logran de alguna manera impedir distracciones, impedir, ¿no es cierto?, que las políticas que vienen desde fuera distraigan lo que allí ocurre. Son escuelas en las cuales hay una coherencia respecto a lo que hace internamente y todo eso más o menos lo sabemos. Lo que no sabemos es cómo se llega hasta ahí, ¿ya? ¿Cómo se convierte una escuela como la que se trabaja, ¿no es cierto?, habitualmente muchos de ustedes, en una escuela efectiva, en una escuela que efectivamente tiene estas características? Esa es la discusión hoy en día más difícil, más que hacer la simple descripción de en qué consiste eso. Y lo interesante del trabajo de Gómez, que él lo mostró, fue justamente el relato de ese camino. Es decir, aquí hay un método para realizar eso. Y es un método que tiene ciertas etapas, que tiene ciertas herramientas, que tiene una manera de realizarse, en la cual, por ejemplo, siempre se parte, les doy solo una nota sobre eso, ¿no es cierto? Siempre se parte de los problemas más sentidos, pero también más posibles de abordar por la escuela. Y se realiza un análisis muy profundo en la cual se toma en cuenta cómo las personas perciben el problema. Y no se trae una definición desde fuera de cuáles son los problemas que tienen que ser trabajados, ni menos de cómo tienen que ser resueltos, sino que eso nace, ¿no es cierto?, en una mejora desde adentro de la escuela hacia afuera, con una metodología particular. Y este año tendremos la posibilidad, ¿no es cierto?, de tener esta conferencia respecto de qué significa trabajar en escuelas en contextos desafiantes. Pusimos este tema como tema central, porque es claro que es uno de los grandes temas que hoy día está en la discusión nacional. En la discusión educativa, ¿no es cierto?, está primero este reconocimiento de que los contextos desafiantes no solo existen, no solo no disminuyen, sino que incluso se acrecientan y se vuelven más complejos. Y que hay fenómenos nuevos para nosotros, como es la migración, que están haciendo que estas escuelas sean todavía más complejas que lo que eran antes. Por lo tanto, ya no es solo, ¿no es cierto?, un tema de pobreza, como ha sido por siglos en Chile, sino que adicionalmente al tema de pobreza y de capital cultural, entonces de las familias, de carencias materiales y de falta de expectativas educativas, se han adicionado ahora otros elementos que también son muy importantes, como es justamente, por ejemplo, el elemento cultural que les estoy diciendo, ¿cierto? En escuelas que uno ve, ¿no es cierto?, en los cuales hay un 20% de alumnos haitianos que no conocen nuestro idioma, cuyas familias vienen con otras costumbres y usos respecto a la crianza de sus hijos. ¿Cómo se lidia con eso? ¿Cómo se trabaja en esas realidades? O en escuelas, ¿no es cierto?, en otros lugares de Chile donde la matrícula escolar rota permanentemente y los estudiantes, ¿no es cierto?, están peridos en la escuela, pero después los padres se mueven y ellos también se transportan y por lo tanto la matrícula escolar es como una suerte de matrícula que tiene permanentemente un grupo flotante con el cual hay que estar trabajando. ¿Cómo se hace eso? ¿Cómo se trabajan estas escuelas desafiantes? Quisimos ponerle este término, escuelas desafiantes. También podríamos haber puesto escuelas de alta complejidad sociocultural. Y no quisimos ponerle a escuelas vulnerables. Y fue una decisión nuestra respecto a este tema. Primero porque vulnerables somos todos, ¿ya? Aquí no hay nadie que se salve de ser vulnerable, como persona, como instituciones, como escuela. Pero segundo porque la vulnerabilidad de alguna manera ponía la responsabilidad en la propia escuela. Estas son las escuelas vulnerables, ellas son las vulnerables. Aquí estamos diciendo algo distinto. Estas son las escuelas más complejas. Y tenemos, ¿no es cierto?, que ayudar a esa alta complejidad a ser resuelta. Es semántica, pero el lenguaje crea realidades, lo sabemos, y por lo tanto era importante para nosotros llamarlas de otra manera. Esto está también, por cierto, asociado a la discusión nacional que existe hoy día y que el gobierno ha puesto con tanta fuerza respecto a las escuelas llamadas insuficientes y qué va a ocurrir con ellas. Que es algo también, ¿no es cierto?, que en la política educativa hoy día está en la máxima discusión. Tenemos una ley en la cual se dice que por primera vez se tienen que empezar a cerrar estas escuelas que son insuficientes desde el punto de vista académico. Y eso, ¿no es cierto?, deberá pasar a la vuelta de la esquina, mañana, o sea, el próximo año, en fin, muy pronto. Estamos hablando de más de 200 establecimientos, pero si sumamos los liceos que entran el año que viene, estamos hablando ya de 400, y si sumamos, ¿no es cierto?, o sea, hay un flujo en la cual habría como una nueva política en marcha, que sería esta política de cerrar las escuelas insuficientes. Pero la verdad es que como país no sabemos qué quiere decir esto. ¿Qué significa cerrar una escuela? Incluso fíjense que no sabemos qué implica físicamente. ¿Significa ponerle un candado a la escuela y convertir esa escuela en un policlínico, en un retén o en otra cosa? ¿Significa que la escuela se despida a todo su personal y se contrata un nuevo personal? ¿Significa que se le cambia de nombre? Fíjense que no sabemos ni siquiera eso. Y sin embargo insistimos en que se van a cerrar las escuelas. Y no pensamos, ¿no es cierto?, qué significaría para esas comunidades escolares ese cierre. Y si es la mejor solución respecto a este tema. Solamente les digo que lo que dice la ley es que esas escuelas pierden su reconocimiento oficial. Es decir, si alguien quiere que siga funcionando en esa misma escuela, va a tener que ser legalmente otra escuela, ¿ya? Lo que no es, por cierto, nada inmediato. En fin, no me interesa abundar en ese tema, que es un tema polémico, pero muy importante porque está hoy día en la discusión, pero sí quiero decirles que también forma parte de por qué la selección de este tema, como un tema, ¿no es cierto?, tan sustantivo e importante. Y en ese tema, aparte de esta conferencia internacional, también estamos realizando como centro 2 otras iniciativas. Una es nuestro cuarto libro de la serie, en la cual estamos produciendo un libro en el cual justamente estamos recopilando lo que se sabe en distintos lugares del mundo sobre este tema y que vamos a tener, ¿no es cierto?, hacia final de año. Y otro que es un documento de política en el cual le vamos a sugerir justamente al gobierno respecto a qué políticas se podrían tener para fomentar el liderazgo en estos contextos altamente desafiantes. En este caso, en esta cuarta conferencia, hemos tenido la fortuna de contar con la profesora S Finnigan. S Finnigan es una académica muy destacada de la Universidad de Rochester, en la cual, de Norteamérica, ella ha trabajado distintos temas, ella lo va a contar respecto de los temas que tienen que ver de alguna manera con escuelas desafiantes, y algunos temas están en el corazón y otros están aparentemente en la periferia, pero de alguna manera creo que se juntan. Y ella ha tenido a bien venir a comentarnos justamente lo que hoy en día se discute respecto a estos temas a nivel internacional. Entonces, aquí es un tema, ¿no es cierto?, que no son solo nosotros. Temas como los que yo le contaba, como cuáles son los métodos para llegar a ser una escuela como una escuela que mejore en contextos desafiantes y la ciencia la mejora, es algo bueno que no solo se está discutiendo en Chile. O temas como si las políticas públicas tienen que cerrar las escuelas insuficientes, no solo se está discutiendo en Chile, se están discutiendo también en otros contextos y por eso es tan importante y tan pertinente muchos de los elementos que vamos a conocer esta mañana. Déjenme solamente decirles que la profesora Finnigan no solo ha estudiado el tema desde el punto de vista de la escuela, sino que también ha estudiado el tema desde el punto de vista de lo que son los distritos escolares, que vendrían a ser para nosotros, ¿no es cierto?, los municipios, ¿ya?, o redes de escuelas más amplio territorialmente distribuidas. Por lo tanto, su interés no se ha limitado solamente al tema de la escuela en sí misma y la microacción en la escuela, sino a redes de escuela. Y que también ha desarrollado un método muy interesante que tiene que ver, ¿no es cierto?, con el análisis de redes sociales. Es decir, que cómo se construyen las redes de influencia dentro de la escuela. Social Network Analysis, ustedes lo van a ver, ¿no es cierto?, y que es algo muy novedoso en Chile. Que yo conozca, no tenemos análisis de Social Network Analysis, y ustedes van a ver que es algo extraordinariamente interesante y útil para entender lo que es la dinámica escolar, cómo se construye esa dinámica escolar. Quiero agradecerle muy fuertemente a S Finnigan por estar con nosotros. Como ustedes pueden ver, ella está haciendo un pequeño mini tour por Chile, ¿ya? Ayer estuvo en Temuco, mañana va a estar en Talca, haciendo, ¿no es cierto?, este esfuerzo que las cosas no solo lleguen a Santiago, sino que vayan más lejos y tengan también acceso esos colegas a esta posibilidad. Les pido un aplauso para Cara y un agradecimiento muy fuerte por estar aquí. Muchas gracias.
Bien, agradecemos las palabras del director del SEDLE, dando comienzo entonces a este seminario internacional. Antes de pasar con nuestra invitada internacional, ustedes pueden ser parte activa de este seminario. ¿De qué manera? Si ustedes tienen dudas, preguntas, inquietudes respecto del tema que se va a presentar en el día de hoy, pueden escribir sus preguntas. Entiendo que ustedes tienen lápiz y papel en sus carpetas. Ustedes pueden escribir esas preguntas porque al final de este seminario, el doctor Weinstein con nuestra invitada internacional van a responder esas preguntas en una especie de conversatorio final, haciendo el resumen de este seminario internacional. Ustedes escriben sus preguntas y durante el seminario y durante la presentación de nuestra invitada internacional vamos a recoger esas preguntas que se van a responder al final entonces con nuestra invitada internacional. Dicho esto entonces, sin duda en el día de hoy nos encontramos reunidos actores de diferentes ámbitos del mundo educativo y académico con un solo propósito y también un solo compromiso: alcanzar el mejoramiento de los procesos educativos que impacten en el aprendizaje de niños, niñas y jóvenes de nuestro país. Es por ello que es un honor y una oportunidad de aprendizaje contar esta mañana con la presencia de nuestra invitada internacional. Ella es especialista en procesos de mejora escolar. Ella es profesora de liderazgo y políticas educativas en la Universidad de Rochester. Ha dirigido investigaciones y evaluaciones de políticas y programas educativos a nivel local, estatal y federal durante más de 25 años. En sus investigaciones combina perspectivas de educación, sociología y ciencia política. Emplea métodos tanto cualitativos como cuantitativos, incluyendo el análisis de redes sociales y el mapeo GIS, y se centra también en los distritos escolares urbanos. Su presentación, Liderando escuelas en contextos desafiantes, fortaleciendo las capacidades para la mejora. Le brindamos un cariñoso aplauso de bienvenida a la doctora S Finnigan.
Hola. I am very happy to be here to talk about leading schools in challenging contexts. It's been an area I have focused on for a number of years and a very important area both in the US and in Chile. I have my Twitter handle if you are on Twitter and would like to connect that way, and I've added my email also if you'd like to follow up and have any questions after. And at the end of the presentation, I have included a website where many of my articles are, including a couple translated into Spanish, mostly in English. So I do know un poco español, but I wouldn't get very far in my conversation with you today. So I am grateful for the translators who are helping you to understand the things I'd like to talk about. And I am very excited to be here in Chile. I've never been here. And it's been such a wonderful experience so far to be able to meet and learn from so many different people. I'm especially grateful to Jose and Francisca and all of the people at SEDLE, and everybody here in Santiago who has made this event possible. And I'm glad that all of you decided to come. So what is this a map of, I ask? And you might know that it's a map of the United States. But what is a little different is you see a number of red markers around the United States, and those are places that I have lived in the United States. And I use this to talk about my work in the United States because I think it helps to explain that I have seen a number of different types of educational systems in our country. And geographically, I've been in different communities, and also I've studied many different communities across the United States. So it gives me an understanding both on individual systems in the US, but also in thinking across them. I'm sure there's similar things here in Chile where there might be some differences across your country, but then if you move it up a level and think about how you think about these things in combination. So I do come from the University of Rochester, which is in New York, close to Canada, not as close to New York City. But before that, I've been there about 16 years, and before that, I worked in a number of think tanks in the United States, and those are organizations that do contract research with governmental agencies. So for about 25 years, I've been studying educational systems, educational leadership, and educational policy in many areas that directly relate to our conversation today. So I am going to talk to you today in 3 parts. The first part is, what do we mean by challenging contexts? We've talked a little bit already about some of the things going on in Chile, and I'll talk to you about the United States as well. Also, part 2 is, why do leaders matter so much? And this is important to the conversation about challenging contexts in particular. And part 3, how do leaders build the capacity for school or district improvement? So let's start with, what do we mean by challenging contexts? In the US, we refer to a lot of different things when we talk about educational challenges. And I found this word map from one state, Minnesota, that I think represents a lot of the conversation that you hear. So the words that are discussed have things to do with schools and students and rates of achievement on different tests. There's things around white students versus what we call students of color who are African American or Latino students. And mostly a conversation is usually around the gap between some of our students, either the students who are more affluent or the students who are white, and other students, the students who are more poor or students who come from different backgrounds culturally. So the this map represents a lot of the conversation, but it doesn't really get at what is going wrong. It just gets what we see as the problems as they exist in terms of the symptoms of these problems. And over decades, we've been worrying about these kinds of issues around performance on tests and different rates of performance for different populations. And in many ways, this has come to a point of crisis and despair in the United States. These are two of our major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. And this is the kind of way people often talk about these things these days. The question of how to fix broken schools is a great unknown in education, particularly in big city school districts. Many of the challenges are also in rural contexts in the United States, but because so many students live in the urban context where we see these challenges, we tend to focus on those communities more as far as tackling these kinds of challenges. And the Washington Post a couple of years ago said, "What should states do about their worst public schools? States still don't seem to know." So sometimes people throw their hands up in the air, and other times they worry, and a lot of what has happened in the United States is that there has been a lot of blame. So pointing of fingers of who's causing this problem. And a lot of times people blame students or parents, but especially they blame teachers, and now more and more they blame leaders. So these are just a few newspaper cartoons that kind of demonstrate the conversation in a humorous way about how we continue to blame teachers especially. And so you can see on the left-hand side, the comic is throwing tomatoes at the teachers and wondering why they don't want to come back to teach. And then on the top right side, this is a point making where it used to be that the parents would blame the child, but now the parents and the children go and blame the teacher when their performance is not at a high enough level. And then this bottom one, I think, is especially important as we understand these challenging contexts, because what it shows is that the Duncan agenda, that was a former Secretary of Education, it shows on the desk some of the challenges that individual children have, whether they're homeless or they don't have books or they are pregnant or different things that might be going on in their own lives, and yet the people are walking in with sort of, angry at the teacher, blaming them, saying, "What are you going to do about it?" without understanding these other contextual problems. So some of my work I have focused on these kinds of policy trends around accountability and choice policies and how they tend to focus on sort of technical aspects of education in terms of the curriculum and instruction and things like that, performance on tests, without paying as great attention to these underlying social contexts or conditions. So this is a book I recently published with my colleague Jennifer Jellison-Holm, who's from Texas. And we did a study across the United States in several communities, and we used GIS tools, which is geographic mapping tools, to look at those patterns. So we were trying to understand over time, what did we see as far as the communities that these schools that were being targeted for sanction were located in? What were we noticing about their situation in terms of the underlying context, the social context of those communities? So just to give you an example of thinking about these contexts in the broader way, not just the schools themselves. Here's an example of one of the maps that we use in this book and in our work. This is actually a map of where I live in Rochester. And this is a map from many years ago, although it's only gotten worse today. And what you can see on this map is it's shaded by poverty. And so the darker areas are the highest poverty areas, and the lighter areas are the lowest poverty areas. And in many of the communities that Jennifer Jellison-Holm and I have been studying, we find this similar pattern, with poverty being so concentrated in the inner city. And this is part of the challenging situations that families have, because along with poverty comes a number of other issues. Just to show the more severe estimates here, this is more recent, and it is also childhood poverty. So in a community, you might see it spread out more, as I was saying, to some of the more rural areas. But still in the central city, you can see, so the very dark, it might be hard to tell on this visual, but the very dark areas are over 75% childhood poverty. So those are very difficult conditions. And many of our policies in education don't address these kinds of issues. So just to give a quick, the flip side of the coin is the wealth. And so this is a map of wealth in the same community that you're seeing. And so if it's dark, now it's a more affluent area, and if it's light, it's a poorer area. And it just helps to show the stark contrast. This is not a very large geographic area. In fact, these communities are maybe 10 minutes apart that you're looking at. So people go into the communities for different groceries or libraries or things like that, but the schools are very separate, and that's caused a lot of problems. And in our book, we talk about how part of the issue is that over time, we've been not understanding those larger problems. And so as we increase the sanctions and talk about the schools that are failing or not meeting targets, we're misunderstanding some of these larger challenges that are going on. And this is just one map from one of our cities. Again, we saw it in many of them. This is Milwaukee. And what you see here are shaded areas. The red is the highest populations of Latino and Black students, or African American. And these tend to also be the highest poverty areas. And the dots are the schools that were targeted for closure because they weren't doing well. And actually, the squares are the ones that were closed. And you can see the patterns are very close to those same locations that struggle in many other ways in terms of poverty or families who speak other languages and a number of other issues that are going on in those communities that are not being addressed by some of these policies around accountability themselves. So in our book, we talk about thinking more deeply about the context and policies that could be used in ways to disrupt some of these patterns and create more equitable opportunities for children. But we have these situations right now today that many people like you are probably in, and you have to figure out, well, what do we do right now? But it's important to understand this context because one of the things that has happened is that over time, this increased accountability has put a lot of pressure, a lot of demands on districts and schools, and especially on school leaders. And so as you think about what must happen, leaders now must change course. They might have been doing things for a while, and now they have to think about doing some things differently within their schools, in spite of all these challenges we were talking about. And they must learn how to transform their organizations. And many people are not prepared to do this. They've not necessarily been trained to think about how you transform an entire organization. And a lot of what we do in the US is we've been paying a lot of attention to using evidence and data as part of that process. Now, just to sum up sort of this, what's going on in these challenging contexts, though, there is a cycle, or more like a spiral, where the low performance is also in the same communities where there's high trauma in terms of poverty, poor health, homelessness, things like that. And there's also high mobility in terms of whether teachers or students and families or leaders are moving in and out of those. And then that leads to greater pressure, increased blame, and a disinvestment in many of those communities and schools, which then just sort of makes this process, aggravates this even more. So we want to think about ways to disrupt that, both within the school but outside of the school setting. Okay, so why do leaders matter so much? Part 2. We know a great deal, actually, about research on leaders and how they serve an important role both in managing the organization and in motivating teachers and supporting them. So leaders have an indirect rather than a direct effect on students, really through the teachers and the school organization itself. Now, we know less, actually, in the research about leadership in challenging contexts. And I think this is really important to think about differently because leadership in general, we know, well, there's certain strategies that you might have to do, but given all of the things I was discussing before and the extra pressures, leaders have a different kind of a situation that they must confront. So my own research in Chicago years ago, which you may read, there's an article in your folder, I believe, that's been translated from that work. This focused on schools it was called probation, and it was the same kind of idea of accountability sanctions where they were targeted and had to improve within a certain amount of time. And I was part of a team that studied these schools, and this was before, in the US, we've had even greater accountability at the federal level. This was a state level policy. So this was one of the early communities dealing with this area of increased sanctions and targeting schools. My work focused on 10 elementary schools, and in those schools, I talked to teachers and leaders and some students, but a little bit more of the educator level, and tried to understand, well, what happened when schools now were told, hurry up and improve? What kinds of processes did they go through? It also involved all the schools in the district because there was a survey of teachers, and this was mostly trying to understand teachers' views of their leaders to help to explain how these changes happened. And my work focused on leadership and motivation, in particular within those schools. So what happened? How did leaders help their schools improve? My research found that one thing they did was they articulated a very clear vision relating to the reforms that they wanted to put into place. So this allowed them to be both specific about something that was going to happen and why they were doing it a certain way. It also allowed buy-in from the other people in the community because everybody sort of was able to get on the same page. They also focused on longer-term strategies, including structural changes and norms. These are things that take a little time to fix. And that's difficult to focus on longer-term strategies when you have so much pressure to do things quickly. So some schools that actually didn't see improvement focused on the shorter-term approaches, certain things with maybe kids who were right on the edge of the performance target, just to get them over that hump. And they weren't thinking about deeper changes that had to happen in the school in terms of areas, things like bringing teachers into contact with new ideas and allowing them to try out those new ideas. Those were longer-term approaches to changing instructional practices. The other long-term strategy was developing more of a positive climate. And that can be difficult if people are all feeling focused on and blamed for things. And so having to find a way to develop trust among each other and also to follow through with resources and listen to teachers in terms of understanding what their needs were and trying to figure out how to help support them. And a last one that I think we were talking about, it's a little hard to do, but they buffered the teachers from the negative pressures, the aspects of the policies, this blame that I keep talking about, everybody finger pointing, they sort of kept that away. They took that on, and they let the teachers know that they were going to be able to do this, and they were going to support them in getting through it. And that really helped a lot with both individual teacher motivation and with overall morale in the school. So the successful leaders in this study improved teachers' motivation and what we call expectancy in the organizational leadership and in the organizational leadership literature. Expectancy has to do with both valuing the outcome that's supposed to happen. So if you feel like it's not worth working towards that, you're not going to work towards that. So you have to both value the outcome and you have to think you can get there. So in the case of these schools, the principal played a really important role in helping the teachers to believe that if they could do things a little differently or learn some different strategies, that their kids could improve on these tests and that it was worth that effort for both them as individual children and for the school as a whole, for them to be able to show these kinds of improvements. Now, in my research, I mentioned there was a quantitative part as well. That was a survey of all the schools in the whole city of Chicago. And what we found there is, unfortunately, some of these more transformational leadership behaviors that I'm talking about were less likely to happen in these schools that had more challenging contexts. When they did happen, though, we saw this improvement in motivation, which led to improvement in performance of the teachers and then of the students. One thing that leaders also realized is that there's a way that it was not just individual learning that had to happen, but collective learning among all of the teachers and leaders within the school. So this gets at the idea of these professional learning communities that Jose was mentioning earlier. You have to have structured time to do that, to learn together and collaborate and share what went wrong, not just what went right, to try to get to new ways of thinking about how to solve some of these challenges within the school setting. So the leaders in these challenging contexts that we studied, just to summarize, had a long-term vision. They had created a culture of collaboration. They had supported both individual learning of teachers and also this idea of collective learning together through that culture of collaboration. And they buffered them from these outside pressures. In many ways, it can be useful to think about these kinds of areas at all levels of the educational system. If you have a long-term vision, if you have ways of connecting people and their ideas and practices, and if you have support for new types of learning and new strategies, we can, I think, see more success at different levels of the system. So I'm talking about now both the school and moving up to the district, the state, the country. Okay, so most importantly, though, how do leaders build this kind of capacity within their own schools or across a district? In my work, I've realized that as you think about school improvement, it's really important to think about schools as systems. So I have two books that I've co-edited with my colleague Alan Daly at the University of California at San Diego. And in both of these books, we talk about how the system works. So in the first book, Using Research, Evidence, and Education, it's talking about all levels of the educational system and how evidence from research moves into those contexts, whether it's a classroom or a school or a state, and how those help new learning in those different units. And in the second book, we talk about some of the ways that this is especially important here today, in that this idea of pressure. And when communities are under pressure, they have different kinds of solutions and strategies that are needed. And many of this gets back to the underlying relationships that exist. And that's what I'm going to shift to now. So I realized that maybe Dr. Seuss has not made it to Chile. Has anybody ever heard of Dr. Seuss? Raise your hand. Oh, good. What about Horton Escucha a Quien? Anybody heard of that? Oh, good, a couple of people. So this is a children's book in the United States, and I used it to just to illustrate what I want to talk about in terms of systems. And I've used this in other talks. So Horton is an elephant who finds a little flower, and he's sort of a simple creature, and he's just delighted by this pretty little flower he's found. But he's hearing something from the flower, and it turns out it's a voice, somebody crying out to him, saying, "Help, help, here we are," you know? And it turns out there's this world called Whoville in this little flower. I know it's hard to believe, it's a children's book. But this is what I'd like to think about in terms of educational problems and challenges and systems. We often think that things like leading in a challenging context takes some simple solutions, but it really doesn't. There's a very complex system within the organization of schools. There's many different people, parents, students, teachers, social workers sometimes, leaders. There's also different disciplines. There's different things that we want children to learn and understand how to do and to get along with each other and things like that. It's very complicated. And so complicated systems require complicated solutions and an understanding, really, of those dynamics. So I want to talk about the system of educators in particular. So this is a typical formal organizational hierarchical structure. And in a school, you would have the red would be the school leader or principal. And this is what we think of a lot in organizations in terms of these formal positions of authority. But there's a great deal of literature on organizations that suggests that this kind of web that you see in the far right corner, this web of informal connections and relationships is actually much more important to what happens in the organization. And in fact, the red square of the leader is often very peripheral in this web of people. If you can see where they end up in this more informal relationships, they sometimes don't know all of the kinds of things that are going in the organization, even though they have this formal position of authority. So the work that I'm going to talk about now that involves social network analysis, as Jose mentioned, it comes from a 10-year study that I've been doing with my colleague Alan Daly, and it's been a variety of educational settings across the United States, including both schools and districts. It's a longitudinal study that's involved 4 years of qualitative and quantitative data, and over 1,000 educators have been involved between surveys and interviews, and it was funded by 2 of our research foundations in the United States. So one thing that's very important in terms of thinking about education policy and reform and school improvement is that we often emphasize the human capital side, or the skills of teachers and leaders, what they need to know how to do. And this is considered the technical side of reform. It's a very important piece, but it's not the only piece to how change happens. We pay a lot less attention, especially for adults and their own learning, as far as the social side, the connections, and this gets back to, again, the professional learning communities. That's part of where that literature comes from. But the social connections that people have with each other helps in their own thinking and learning and development. And so in some ways, it's not just thinking about what they need to know and do, but how they're going to do it. An organizational theorist, Margaret Wheatley, has said that in organizations, real power and energy is generated through relationships. And the capacity to form those relationships is more important than tasks, functions, roles, or positions. And so there's a book, actually, by Esther Quintero on this idea of the social side of reform. And she pulls together several different US scholars and their research that focuses on this different way that you have to think about, that we've been limited maybe in our improvement strategies without thinking about this area of relationships. So my own work in this particular study involved, as I mentioned, quantitative and qualitative data. And I'm not going to run through all of this, but for those of you who are interested, these are the kinds of data that we collected in each of those areas. And so at the school and district level, we were doing interviews and observations and document review. And then in the surveys, we had measures of trust and organizational learning and risk-taking and things like that. And also this social network analysis piece, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Does anybody in the room already know about social network analysis? Okay, great. A few people do. So this will be repetition for you, but for everyone else, social network analysis is a methodology and also a conceptual lens. It's based in theories of social capital. And it measures relationships and flows between a number of different things. In my work, I focus on educators in terms of both teachers and leaders. And what social network analysis helps you to think about are the connections that people have. And so whenever you see social network analysis maps, you'll see some kind of representation like a dot for an individual, and then lines between them are representing those connections. And we talk about in social network analysis resources that flow. And in this case, we don't mean economic resources. We mean other kinds of resources like ideas or expertise or emotional connections or trust. Things like that are the resources in this case. And you can ask about a lot of different resources. And I'll talk a little bit about the ones we've focused on in our work. Another thing that's important to know about social network analysis is that there's really 2 primary ways of thinking about these connections. One is the complete network. So it would be like this entire room if we were to see how people were connected around certain understandings or even just knowing each other prior to this day. Another way to think about it is the ego, or some person's individual network. So for example, if we thought about all of Jose's connections in this room, from his perspective out, that's an ego network. And so you can see the green dot is sort of the different representation. It's where the person is in the entire network or where their own little network is or what it looks like. And there's a lot of things we can learn from these network relationships. My own work focuses on the complete network for the most part. So I just wanted to orient you to a couple of things around social network analysis before you see my data so that you know what you're looking at. So this helps to show you just some very basic things. In the bottom left corner is what it looks like when you set up the data in a matrix. And it just shows if you asked a question like, who do you turn to for expertise, you would have a 1 in the cell if you have that connection, if for example, Lisa turns to John, and you would have a 0 if you didn't have that connection. And then on top of that, you can have, when you're visualizing it, so panel A would just be, does it exist at all in terms of that tie? Panel B helps you to see about the direction of the tie. And most of my work looks at this directionality as well, because that's an important thing to think about. So if I'm turning to somebody for new ideas and they don't turn to me for new ideas, that would be kind of an interesting thing that you would want to think about. You also, in panel C, can show, and when you visualize these things, you can show the strength of the tie. So maybe I talk to somebody every day, but I'd only talk to somebody else once a month. And so you can visualize that as well. These are things that you can manipulate when you're looking at the data. And last, you could have some kinds of attributes around individuals. So maybe you're looking at teachers who teach math versus teachers who teach science, and you want to see the different connections that people have. Also, when you think about these maps, they end up looking sort of like spider webs, so you have to know what you're looking at. And one thing that people pay attention to is how much control certain people have over the flow of whatever resources you're looking at. And so you can see sometimes we look at things like centrality. Who do people go to a lot? You know, who do most people go to, I guess is the way to say it. Or sometimes we look at things like brokering, which means that you're connecting different people who are not connected. So these circles just show you those two different examples of somebody who's very central versus somebody who's brokering or connecting different parts of the organization. So those were all just to get you oriented. Now to look at some of my data from schools in the United States. So this is an actual network map from my research. And what you see here, every dot is an educator within the school. Some of them are teachers who are either yellow or black colors. And usually you can visualize these things differently by color or shape or things like that, size. And the reason why the black is just we didn't have as much details, but they are also teachers within the school. The orange colored dots are anybody who was not a classroom teacher. They were in a leadership role, or they might have been a social worker or some other person within the school, but who was not in a classroom. In this case, and often we size it by centrality. So you can just take a look very quickly and see who are most people going to, because the size is the bigger node in this case. And all of the ones on the left that's not a mistake. That means that nobody turns to them and they don't turn to anybody. So in this case, we asked about who do you turn to advice, who do you turn for advice that you use in your work? And this was just the school itself. They might go to somebody outside the school, that's okay. But when you're thinking about improvement and change as an organization, it's important to know that many people are not connected at all into this network of relationships. The other thing to know when you look at this, it's a very sparse network. So it's sometimes hard to tell exactly how much would be a lot, but I would tell you that this is a sparse network. And one of the reasons it's actually even as connected as it is because this one person that sometimes you see this idea of like a spoke of a wheel. And that's somebody who nobody goes to them, that's why they're so small, but they go to a lot of people. And so they're actually connecting a lot of people into this network because of that. So the other thing to think about when you look at network maps, as I mentioned, directionality, it might be hard to see on the map, but you can see the arrows, which they go one way or another. And reciprocal ties can be really important, as I mentioned. So sometimes reciprocal ties are seen as a quality of a tie. And in many of these low-performing or challenging schools, we did not see very many reciprocal ties. And the last area I wanted to call your attention to here is that this is a very centralized network because so many people because there's only one large node. And that node, in this case, was the principal, the leader of the school. And we saw that a lot in our study, that the principal played a very important role as somebody that people would turn to. Sometimes you could think about it as too important of a role because you don't want it just to be everybody going to one person. It can be useful to have it more distributed because it can be more sustainable in terms of change. Because then one person doesn't get burned out, and also oftentimes the principal ended up leaving, as is the case in this school. This is a different school. It's a much bigger school. And this time it's the same sort of scenario that you can see. It's exactly the same colors that the principal and the other leaders or non-classroom people are orange, and then everybody else is a classroom teacher. And you can see that, again, there's a lot of people on, we call them isolates. They're not in the network at all. So they don't turn to anyone for advice and nobody turns to them. And there's a lot of people, what we call the periphery. They're just really out. Maybe one or two people turns to them. And it's a very centralized, this one's very, very centralized. And what happened is, as part of a policy in the US, that principal was moved to another school. And you can picture just taking apart this entire network as the principal leaves. So that can be really difficult. And schools often in our study were having this kind of turnover, which meant that it was really hard to learn as a group because it was always new people and new relationships that had to be built. So I just want to show you a few schools in combination, and sometimes it can be difficult when you're just looking at them with your eye to see the differences. But this is, again, this is a more general tie around advice, and who do you turn to for advice that you use in your practice. And let's call them A, B, and C at the bottom. And you can probably tell just visually that the C is a little less connected than the others. And this is a very general, we call this a general work-related tie because it's around your work, but it's not something specific that you have a problem with. It's more generally. So people are going, it groups everybody who's going to with different problems to different people, just as a sense of who do they go to for advice. Now, in the organizational literature, though, this idea of instrumental ties is very important. It gets at that more technical part I was talking about. But also these emotional ties are critical. And in fact, the literature says you won't respond to the instrumental ties unless you have this trusting relationship with someone. So, for example, if I go to somebody for advice in my own office, I think, well, I'll just see what they think, and they tell me something, and then I think, well, I don't really trust their view. Then I'm not going to use that advice. And that's very well documented in the literature. And if you can see here, this is an emotional tie. We use the idea of venting. If you're going to complain to someone, get something off your chest, like who do you turn to? And you can see these are more sparse than the prior networks. And also, things are sort of getting worse for School C because they have fewer of these kinds of emotional supports and trusting relationships. And then the third area here, it's the same three schools. And this is a more specific work-related tie. And we often see this, that there's more connection around kind of general advice, but when you get to more specific problems, people are less likely to go ask for help. And so in this case, we were asking about who do you turn to when you're wanting to share or receive some instructional materials that might help you in your work. And this, as you can see, what is even more sparse, but especially for School C. And these are all really connected. So you can think about, as I was saying, like if you don't trust the people, you're probably, even if you want general advice, you're not going to ask for specific advice. And this is why these underlying relationships, especially building the kinds of supports and trust in the network, are so important when we overlook this in thinking about change processes because we're so focused sometimes on what we want to happen without understanding this is part of how it happens. I wanted you to know about the social network maps. They're visually very useful, and I use these when I conduct this research. I go back to the schools or the districts and show them some of these maps so that they can think about for themselves what does it mean that some people are so disconnected in our school, and how might we do things differently? They don't need to know who it is. They just need to know the structure and try to understand it. But there's also numbers behind all of these maps. And so there's measures that are used that are just being displayed visually. And so a few of the ways that we think about these measures are, some common ones are density. I've been talking a lot about how sparse the network is. So the opposite would be a very dense network. We don't see those very much. You don't want one that's so dense that nobody could get any work done. So there's sort of an in-between from the very sparse that I've been showing you and the very dense. You want something where people are connected, especially through clusters, but everybody shouldn't be going to everybody all the time. That's not a useful way to spread ideas and practices. And another thing that we think about is fragmentation, and that's how hard it is for people to connect with each other, sort of how many people wouldn't even be connected at all. And so just to show you, if you recall that instructional materials map for School C that was so sparse, you can see the, here you can see this one is much less, but it was a little hard to tell with B. So visually, so those might not be significantly different, but with A, it was definitely, they were going to each other more than in the other two schools. And so this is a way that you can kind of test out the differences, because sometimes it's hard to tell visually how much those are real differences. Similarly, you think a lot about out degree and in degree. So the number of outgoing ties an actor has, or the number of incoming ties. And this is another way of thinking about some of the measures that help you to compare networks with each other. And so in some cases, for example, we talked about how there were fewer ties in C. And you can see that now with some of these measures. These are just these kind of average proportion of ties people have. So in C, they only have 5, whereas in A, they have 10. And so you're thinking about these in combination. This helps you to understand what you're looking at visually in terms of the network. Okay, now I want to shift to the district level, because as Jose mentioned, a lot of my work focuses within the schools, but because I'm thinking about policy and school systems, I'm often thinking about that next level up and how ideas and practices are shared or move around an entire system. In our case in the United States, the systems are also under accountability pressures. And so this is a reason why I would look at that level as well. So now you're looking at all of these are what we consider leaders. The red colored nodes are our district level staff, and so we call them central office leaders. And the blue colored nodes are principals, so those are all school leaders. And the squares are principals that are in the most challenging contexts, and so those were the ones that have been designated as low performing schools. And it might be difficult to tell, but if you can see that on the left-hand side, you'll see a number of squares. And this was something we found very interesting and important, because if you see a square on the left-hand side, it means it's a leader of a low-performing school, so one of these challenging schools, that's not connected to anyone else in the entire district, and nobody's connected to them. So this idea of the isolation of low-performing schools, the leaders in these schools, in terms of getting some of these new ideas and practices that are really important in the current context. We have, in the US, and I'm sure here too, we have been thinking about new ways to teach math. We've been thinking about new ways to teach second language learners. We've been thinking about new ways to teach populations that are more diverse. And so if those schools that are the most challenging are isolated from these ideas, that's a problem for the system. So another thing that we look at here is, again, the size of the nodes are important. And so the people who are most likely they turn to for advice are people within the central office. And I think this is an issue too in the United States, because central office leaders are not necessarily turning to principals to understand and get advice to them. It's just a one-way more where everybody is turning to the central office. And that's a disconnect, that people could be learning much more from the principals and their own experiences to be able to better know from the central office how to support them and what kinds of things they might need. Okay, and so the last thing that I wanted to show you around this map is that it's easier now to see a little bit of what I'm talking about these the disconnect, when we just look at principles. So now I've removed all of the central office people, which is that next level up structure that we have, like your municipalities. And now this is just the school leaders, but these are school leaders that are in one unit, one geographic area. So they're not far away in distance from each other. And they're serving many of the same kinds of students, although some have more challenging contexts than others. Again, the squares are the more challenging contexts. And this was very surprising to the leaders in this district when I talked to them about this, because they really did not know that there were so few connections that people were having around turning to each other to understand some of their challenges that they were facing. And so in many ways, if you think about this, every principal is having to recreate these same situations and try the same kinds of strategies without learning from each other. It's not a very efficient way of working. The other thing to think about, again, is that this particular thing can be aggravated when there's competition with each other. And that's what I heard from some of the principals, that one of the reasons they didn't turn towards each other is because they were competing with each other for students. So they didn't really want to share. You can understand that pressure. I understand that they didn't want to share. There's a reason why people feel I need to keep this to myself. But in terms of long-term strategies of change and improvement, that's not going to get us anywhere. We have to figure out a way that people can share ideas and practices and not be penalized in some way for doing so. Otherwise, we're sort of stuck in a system that's not moving forward. Okay, so a last area to show you is that sometimes we think, again, about the technical aspect first, especially under accountability policies. So this is one district, and again, it's the central office leaders are red and the principals are in blue. And this district was trying very hard to start to have more sharing of practices. And you can see that it was somewhat working in terms of these instrumental ties. So they had set up some structures where people would work together. And the individuals themselves said, yes, we are working more together. We're sharing some more ideas. But they weren't seeing much improvement, and they didn't understand why. And we were able to show them one aspect of why, and that's that over the same time period that some of them were starting to share ideas and practices, the emotional ties, the trust and respect between individuals in this district was completely deteriorating. So these are the same exact people from time 1 to time 2, and you can see that this is a little complicated, but if you could think about what was this two systems almost of the central office leaders and the principals, with mostly the shades of red and the shades of blue separate, completely gone, especially with the principals by time 2. So this is really detrimental to organizational improvement. Okay, so what should leaders do? Well, I'll stay there in a minute. So what should leaders do to strengthen the capacity for improvement, given all that I've been talking about? Well, in the organizational literature, there's an area called double loop learning that I find really useful in thinking about organizational change. So what happens in double loop learning is people in these kinds of processes of diagnosing problems and thinking about solutions, they have to join together collectively and engage in this process. And what happens is that they start to think about, what are we doing? What could we do differently? What are our assumptions we're making? How could we think about these things in different ways? And they do it in a collective way in terms of understanding problems and solutions. But if you think about what I showed you before, you can't do that unless you've created a climate of trust that allows that to happen. So in terms of also what the leaders need to do, they need to build some of this human capital. I don't discount the fact that these leaders were very isolated, and so new ideas and practices were not making their way into these systems. So that's a key role that leaders in these contexts can play. And as I mentioned, they can also try to incentivize collaborative work. And this can be difficult. It's a little chicken or egg. Do you get people together when they don't trust each other yet or not? But some of the people in my research discussed that they didn't believe at first that it would help, and they didn't really want to talk to anybody else. They just wanted to do their own work. But over time, as they started to get together, they realized, I could learn something from somebody else. And that actually, it took a little time, but it shifted the culture and the norms. And last, I mentioned a little bit about reciprocal relationships. And part of the reason why you have to build this climate of trust is that what you want are these higher quality of ties and connections. And you want people to be able to learn together. And that reciprocity is what we were a little surprised on our network maps just how few reciprocal ties there were. So it shows that there's movement towards greater trust, but not fully, because more full trust and connectedness would show more of this reciprocity, this back and forth that learning that occurs in these kinds of professional experiences. So that is the end of my presentation. I did want to list my academia website in case you are interested in going on there. You can log on to, if you're not on there internationally, there are many scholars who post their research. In terms of some of it might be in Spanish. I have a few in Spanish, but mostly in English. But that would be a resource for you. And also, as I mentioned, my email and my Twitter in case you have any questions or want to connect that way. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos con un gran aplauso a la doctora S Finnigan por su impecable y gran presentación en el día de hoy en este seminario internacional. Y como yo lo decía al principio de este seminario, la idea es que ustedes sean participantes activos de este seminario. Vamos a continuación a pasar a recoger las preguntas. Si ustedes tienen preguntas, pueden levantar su mano. Vamos a pasar inmediatamente por sus ubicaciones, mientras el doctor Weinstein y nuestra invitada internacional toman ubicación para dar curso a las respuestas de estas preguntas de ustedes. Pueden levantar su mano, por favor. Vamos a retirar inmediatamente estas preguntas.
Muy bien. Mientras van llegando las preguntas, creo que puede ser interesante para la doctora Finnigan y también para todos que sepa un poco más con quiénes está en esta sala. Por eso quería hacerle un par de preguntas para responder con la mano, si pueden ayudar. ¿Quiénes trabajan aquí en colegios, en escuelas o liceos? Perfecto. ¿Quiénes son directivos escolares? Los mismos. ¿Quiénes son profesores? No, profesores que trabajan solo en aula, que no son directivos escolares. Ya, pero también hay algunos. Muy bien, muy bien. ¿Quiénes habían visto estos mapas de relaciones dentro de las escuelas? Un grupo importante, interesante. Muy bien. Solo contarles para los que nos siguen de alguna manera nuestras actividades que cuando tuvimos hace unos años atrás al profesor Jim Spillane en esta misma sala, hablando de liderazgo distribuido, él también mostró, ¿no es cierto?, mapas como estos, en los cuales él hacía una pregunta semejante respecto a quién le pide consejo a usted para construir sus mapas que él nos mostró respecto a cómo estaba distribuido el liderazgo en las escuelas, ¿no es cierto?, en las cuales él trabajaba. Yo tengo una primera pregunta a la doctora Finnigan mientras llegan las otras, que tiene que ver con justamente esta conexión entre liderazgo distribuido y esto que ella nos ha mostrado. En el sentido de si la doctora Finnigan nos mostró, ¿no es cierto?, mapas de escuelas en las cuales habían más densidad, menos densidad y así por delante. Uno podría pensar entonces, bueno, ¿cuál es el buen liderazgo distribuido entre la escuela? Para ponerlo en términos de lo que estamos aquí, ¿no es cierto? En mi escuela, si yo hiciera el mapa, debiera ser un mapa, por ejemplo, en que el jefe de UTP o el director recibiera muchas flechas. Sería un mapa de un liderazgo, un buen liderazgo distribuido, ¿cómo debiera graficarse? O podría ser un mapa en el cual no necesariamente el jefe de UTP o el jefe del departamento tuviese esas flechas. ¿Cuál sería de un punto de vista más normativo, si se quiere, el mapa más deseable y el mapa más indeseable para una escuela?
Okay. One of the things to think about is that for very simple kinds of information that you need everybody to know, maybe there's some new rule that everybody has to know, then a centralized system can be good because everybody will get that information if you're connected to the people as a principal. But for more complex kinds of things like we're talking about, around instructional practices and improvement and things like that, a very centralized network can not work as well. It also can be not as sustainable over time, especially if you have, as we have in the United States, we've had a lot of churn or movement in and out of principals. And so that constant disruption will never help in terms of complex processes. But overall, in terms of thinking about, there's not an exact idea of this is the map that will work. But I would say that you want to have enough teacher leaders, I would call them, who have some kind of expertise that people can turn to also, besides just always situated in the principal. Because first of all, as a principal, you can't be the one talking to everyone, but also there's a way then that it's sustainable because it moves outside of you as an individual into more of the entire unit of the school. And so I think ideally what you would want to do, and often people have either identified people to serve in those roles, or maybe they emerge on their own, or maybe there's a formal position. But in the US, we sometimes have people, they're called teacher coaches, for example. And so those are people within the school setting who other teachers know they can turn to. And they might be a teacher coach around reading instruction or something like that. So I think that overall you want to think about having a way that the connections are more distributed so that they're not all centrally around one person, and also because these are complex issues, so you probably don't have all of the expertise in every area, and you want to make sure that other people do so that they're people that they can turn to also.
Una pregunta que llega es respecto de ejemplos específicos, respecto de cambio, en el sentido, dice, ¿tienes ejemplos específicos de cómo superar posibles sentimientos de estar a la defensiva, de vergüenza y resistencia que los actores escolares, supongo que serán sobre todo los docentes quienes piensan aquí, pueden experimentar cuando confrontan este bajo rendimiento? ¿Cómo se puede superar? ¿Tienes algunos ejemplos quizás en los cuales se ha puesto en acción, digamos, políticas en las cuales se logra justamente este cambio?
Sorry, I was getting the rest of it. I do have some examples. In some of our schools, what we saw is that the leader was able to give them a voice and show them respect and support. And often, maybe either a leader had to learn to do that, or a new leader was put in place who started to do that. So if it's a change in leadership, sometimes it might be, I guess, the new person who came in who had this idea that they were going to act differently in terms of how they treated the teachers, and it had a very large impact on the teachers. But sometimes I think the leaders, they might not move, or it might be people in this room who realize that there are some teachers who aren't working as hard as you might want them to, but maybe it's because they feel like they have been working hard and everybody's blaming them anyway, and people don't understand the kinds of situations they're dealing with. We see that a lot in the United States, where there's this feeling of nobody really understands these challenging contexts. And so I think just in bringing light to the fact that this is very difficult and everyone has to learn new ways to think about these things, and making the teachers realize, I think as a leader, making the teachers realize that you support them. We all have to figure out what to do. You want them to help you think about what to do, and making it more of a collaborative relationship, I think, between the leader and the teacher is what we saw. Not every school in my study did this. I'm not saying it was across the board, but we did see examples of where teachers felt very differently about how their principal was approaching them, And this was part of the buffering that I mentioned. They were sort of pushing away all of that external pressure and saying, I know we can do it. Let's figure out what to do, and letting them have a voice in some of the changes that would take place.
Otras preguntas se refieren más al tema más de investigación, y preguntan si se puede profundizar un poco en los instrumentos. Otra pregunta más específicamente respecto de el tema de los vínculos emocionales y cómo se miden los vínculos emocionales. No sé si podría contar un poco más respecto de esa dimensión.
Certainly. What we use is a survey. This is typically how quantitative social network data is gathered. And we use what you call a bounded network approach. And that means that everybody in the school is part of the network. And so everybody's name in that school is listed on the survey. And then we ask people, well, I should first mention that when we do this, it can be a very time-consuming survey if you do a lot of different networks. And so we go to the school and we talk to them about social network analysis, much like I did to you today, to help them understand why this might matter to them in terms of thinking about this. And then we do the survey, which we do electronically with the school. And what we do is we ask them, often we ask them a frequency of a tie. So how often do you turn to people to ask advice? And we have a time frame for each of the numbers. And then they check all of the people that they turn to for advice. And so we have a very full list that has every name, and they're checking, I went to this person and I didn't go to that person, so they have to think through that. So cognitively, it can take a little bit of time. And in terms of emotional ties, it's a very good question on all of these. How do you know what you're getting in terms of the actual thing that you're asking about? Sometimes the more general ones can be easier for people to think about, but more complicated because you're getting a lot of different types of things that people are asking advice, for example. In terms of emotional ties, we've used a number of different strategies. One thing we've done is we've said, who is a close friend of yours? Something like that, that's just, are they a friend or not? Or we've used this one like, who do you turn to vent, which is kind of somebody that you can trust with your secrets, because if you're going to complain to them, it won't come back and you won't be vulnerable. We've used some other strategies, though, in terms of the quality of the ties. And emotional ties can be difficult, just like any instrumental tie. So you're thinking about turning to them at all. And, I should say, we also say, who do you trust with a problem, or something like that. But we also look at the quality, as I mentioned, in terms of reciprocity. So if it's just a stronger kind of a tie, if I say I trust you and you say you trust me, we can document that. So we can kind of use our methods to also almost triangulate. If we ask whether you collaborate with someone and they say they don't collaborate with you or they just don't list you, then we can use that methodologically. So there's sort of two strategies. There's asking you, and then there's methodologically using some techniques that help us to see whether it seems strong or not. One last thing I'll mention is that we often, when we ask about frequency, we ask, did you turn to them, and I can't remember some of the time frames, but, once a week, once a month, those kinds of things. And it turns out that people are just less accurate in the very open kinds of time periods. They're much more accurate on the frequent time periods. They just have a way of thinking about it over the last week better. We ask about all of them because it helps us to see how you make different calculations about different people. And sometimes we'll just take the most frequent ties because we know those are more accurate than some of the other things. Maybe you talk to everybody in your whole school, once a year. That doesn't help us as much. What we want to see are these stronger connections that you have. And so sometimes the frequency is another way that helps us with that.
Otras preguntas tienen que ver con el tema de las redes entre escuelas. Es decir, cómo se constituyen. Una, por ejemplo, dice acerca del problema del aislamiento de los establecimientos escolares de bajo desempeño ¿En qué medida estos datos sobre relaciones instrumentales y expresivas les ayudan a tomar decisiones sobre a quiénes recurrir, más aún considerando que se encuentran en sistemas de alta presión y competencia? Y yo agregaría, creo que esa es como una dimensión a profundizar, en el sentido cómo uno podría visualizar redes contundentes de apoyo a las escuelas, sobre todo estas escuelas que tienen mayores problemas. ¿Qué es lo que se sabe sobre ese nivel de redes?
Well, there's two things, I guess, when I think about those principles' connections to each other or not, and whether they were principles of more challenging contexts versus the other principles who were not dealing with the same kinds of circumstances. I can definitely see where there could be some value where principles in the more challenging contexts would go to each other because they had similar kinds of contexts. And that wasn't happening very much, but I have to say it was a little bit more frequent than some of the other connections, where if they did go to somebody, it might be to somebody who was also in a challenging context. So on the one hand, you could see value in that because it's somebody who's in a similar type of situation. And as I was talking about, it means that you wouldn't all be starting fresh. You might be able to learn from each other in terms of strategies that were used and that kind of thing. But if you're thinking about organizational improvement in the way that I think that is important in these contexts, you don't just want the ideas to come from the same people. You want some to come from outside of your similar context too. And I think that's where you would want to think about how do we create opportunities for both leaders who are in similar types of schools to be connecting with each other, because there's some learning that they will do together in terms of knowing they have the same kinds of problems. And then you'd also want the opportunity to connect people in different contexts, because I think that could help on both ends. It would help a lot in terms of the leaders in challenging contexts, because at least in our system, a lot of times the people who are in more affluent communities have access to more professional development and more resources, and so they might just have access to more books or things that people are learning that they could share. But also, many times we're finding in the US that some of the places that aren't challenging now are starting to change. They're starting to get new populations of students. They might have more second language learners. So they're soon going to be dealing with some of the same things these other leaders have been dealing with. So you could make it a two-way reciprocal exchange in that case too. I think mostly what we found in this study is that there was so much pressure on these principals to improve and to get students into their schools that they just were shutting off from that possibility. So it would take leadership at that next level up to think about, well, how do we help people to be able to share these ideas and practices in a way that is learning for everybody and not just learning for some. And I think that would take some new leadership strategies, both in terms of cultural change, in terms of collaboration, the norms around collaboration, and it would take some structural change in terms of making sure there's the opportunity, by Skype or in person, to actually have a place that's like a safe place for people to come together and learn from each other and not have it be vulnerable that you might, lose some of your position of authority or, be viewed in a certain way because everybody has challenges that they can learn from. And so I think it's creating a different norm around continuous improvement that would help.
Okay. Y vamos a la última pregunta que llegó. La última pregunta tiene que ver con un tema muy vigente, el tema de la violencia, también en Estados Unidos, ¿no es cierto? Hemos visto en las noticias, ¿no es cierto? Hoy día, que por desgracia ayer ocurrió otro tiroteo en una escuela de Estados Unidos, ¿no es cierto? Nuevamente con muertos y heridos, por lo tanto no es solo una situación que vemos aquí, incluso en Estados Unidos lo vemos de manera, ¿no es cierto?, más violenta aún y con consecuencias peores, pero la pregunta tiene que ver justamente con esta conexión entre violencia dentro de las comunidades escolares y este tipo de reflexión, ¿no es cierto?, sobre capital social, ¿ya?, sobre las relaciones que se establecen dentro de la escuela. Y la pregunta específica es ¿por dónde empezar? Cuando tenemos un clima de violencia entre los estudiantes en una comunidad en donde los padres están superados y los profesores desbordados emocionalmente. cómo se lucha para instalar culturas de respeto y motivación en los estudiantes. Yo agregaría qué pueden aportar este tipo de estudios respecto de cómo enfrentar el tema de la violencia dentro de las escuelas.
Well, it's very difficult when it reaches the level of violence like we're seeing in some of our communities, that's for sure. One thing that we have a school that is, it would be considered a school in a challenging context, that is affiliated with the University of Rochester. And what they did, and I'm just sort of loosely connected to it, but there are some faculty members who have been very involved because we became in charge of the school about 5 years ago. And it's a traditional public school, but it's this policy that allowed us to be the ones running it. And one of the strategies they've used is starting to create these very small communities of students with some adults in the school, and using those opportunities to sort of rebuild some of the connections among students with teachers. Because in many of these schools, as we were talking about with teachers feeling blamed, and we have the same problem with students. Students are often not performing on the tests for many, many reasons beyond their capabilities in a particular area. And so trying to, again, go to that next level down to understanding what is happening in those communities, why are they acting out in a certain way towards teachers or other students, and building that trust. They've seen a lot of success in doing that, again, in small groups of maybe 8 students with one adult that every day they know they'll be there to talk to. And the adults could be anybody. It's teachers, administrators, it could be staff who work at the school in like an administrative position, and just really trying to increase that one, I guess not one-on-one, but 8-to-1 contact with somebody who they know is going to care about them has been a starting point. But that said, I think that's a little separate from the bigger issues around gun violence in our communities that's been happening. And that's where we talk about, in that book that I mentioned, Striving in Common, where we talk about we really have to start looking at some of these other issues that families are facing, our students are facing. Whether somebody is involved in the criminal justice system, whether they're homeless, whether they have food on their table. These are not things that, it's back to that cartoon, like those desks with everybody's problem on it, they're not going away. And if we can think about policies and supports that help to sort of tackle some of those other issues, it seems that we need to get to that point of doing that in addition to focusing on the school system itself and the teaching that's happening in the classroom. So I think what I've been arguing for in the US is that we really start to have a better understanding of these challenging contexts themselves and the policies that need to happen outside of the education sector to start to address those in parallel with focusing on things inside of the education sector.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Cara, por toda esta exposición. A los que les interesa el tema, nosotros siempre hacemos las conferencias, está el PowerPoint, está el artículo, pero también la profesora Finnigan ha puesto, ¿no es cierto?, dónde encontrar más trabajos de ella para los que les interese especialmente a profundizar en este enfoque que hemos conocido hoy día. Muchas gracias por su asistencia y les pido nuevamente un aplauso para la profesora Finnigan.
Bien, agradecemos una vez más al doctor Weinstein, también a la doctora Finnigan por esa impecable presentación. Muchísimas gracias.